Right.
all focused on... Okay, so let's unpack this deep dive. We're looking at a whole stack of sources here, articles, notes, research bits,
Right.
all focused on one very well-known devotion, the Holy Rosary.
Familiar to many, yeah.
And our mission, really, with these sources is to kind of get beyond just the beads, understand the depth, why it's still relevant.
Sort of like exploring the gospel on a string, as some sources put it.
Exactly. So where do the sources start us off?
Well, what's interesting is they immediately point out that using beads or, markers for prayer, it's not just Christian, it's ancient.
Ancient house.
Like 3,000 years back. They show links to practices in Hinduism, Buddhism, Islam, even the songs mentioning counting.
Wow, okay. So not unique.
Not at all. And they mention those early Christian desert monks using pebbles to count our fathers.
Couple's right. So the idea is old. But the rosary itself, how did that come about according to these sources?
It seems to be a gradual thing, mostly between the 12th and 15th centuries, starting pretty simply, like 50 Hail Marys, tied to events in the lives of Jesus and Mary. And eventually it gets that name Rosarium.
Which means rose garden. Right?
Exactly, a rose garden.
Now, what about the St. Dominic tradition? I know that's a big part of the story for many.
It is. The sources mention it, the idea he received it from Mary as a, quote, powerful weapon against heresy.
But how do they square that with the historical view, the gradual development?
Well, they present both. The scholarly view sees that long, slow development. But they also note the Church accepts the Dominic story as a pious belief.
Okay, so not necessarily literal history, but a way of seeing divine guidance.
Yeah, like God's guidance working through that historical process, not just, dropping it out of the sky fully formed.
That makes sense. And then historically, its form really solidified later.
Right. By the 16th century, the sources point to the Council of Trent and Pope Sixtus V adding the name Jesus into the Hail Mary. That was significant.
And its popularity surged sometimes.
Definitely, especially during times of external threat. The Battle of Lepanto in 1571 is the big example they use.
Lepanto, right. What happened there?
Pope Pius V basically called on Christians to pray the rosary for victory against the Ottoman fleet.
And they won.
They did. And the sources really emphasize how this event cemented the rosary's role as a kind of spiritual weapon and led to the Feast of the Holy Rosary.
Interesting. So, history aside, what about the theology? The sources seem to emphasize it's very Christ-focused, despite all the Hail Marys.
Absolutely. That's a key point they make. It's Christ-centered. Mary's role isn't worship. They're clear in that distinction.
So what is her role in the prayer, then?
She's presented as the guide, the one who leads believers to Jesus, the ideal person to intercede for us, as one source puts it. Pope John Paul II said, you learn Christ through Mary.
You learn Christ through Mary. Okay. So it's like a lens.
Kind of. And popes have described it pretty powerfully. Paul VI called it a compendium of the gospel. Pius XII, the most efficacious school of Christian life.
Strong words. What do they mean by school or compendium?
It's about the meditation. When you pray the mysteries, those key events in Jesus's and Mary's lives, you're learning core doctrines, core virtues. It's like a portable catechism.
Or an experiential formation program, as one source called it.
Yeah.
You live the story through prayer.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the prayers themselves are rooted in scripture and tradition. The Our Father came from Jesus directly, right? Matthew 6.
And the Hail Mary.
The first part is straight from Luke's gospel, the angel's greeting, Elizabeth's greeting.
Luke 1, yeah.
Then you've got the Apostles' Creed, summing up beliefs, and the Glory be praising the Trinity. It connects the private prayer to the church's public liturgy, like a private liturgy you can take anywhere.
So the vocal prayers are the rhythm, but the soul is the meditation on the mystery.
That's what the sources stress. The joyful, luminous, sorrowful, glorious mysteries. They cover Christ's life from birth to resurrection.
And each mystery has associated fruits or virtues you're meant to reflect on, right?
Yes, exactly. Like humility from the Annunciation or courage from the carrying of the cross.
Okay, so how does this address the criticisms you sometimes hear, like Catholics worshiping Mary?
The sources tackle that head-on by explaining the difference between latria worship, which is for God alone, and dulia, which is the veneration or honor given to saints, including Mary.
Latria versus dulia. Got it. And the vain repetition argument, praying the same words over and over.
They counter that by saying it's not empty repetition. It's meant to be a meditative rhythm, a background beat for contemplation, like the Jesus prayer in Eastern Christianity, or even repetition you see in the Psalms or the Book of Revelation.
So it's about the focus during the repetition.
Right. The words help focus the mind and heart on the mystery. And the beads, just tools, aids to counting, not idols.
Makes sense. And what about the benefits? What do the sources say people get out of this?
They list quite a few things like deepening your relationship with God, obviously, but also strengthening virtue, finding inner peace, a sense of spiritual protection, and powerful intercession.
And it's interesting how, as the sources note, even things like podcasts are making this very old devotion accessible now.
Yeah, adapting it for today.
So bringing it all together, this deep dive really shows the rosary, according to these sources, isn't just beads. It's presented as much more.
Definitely. It's framed as a structured journey through the Gospels, centered on Christ, packed with theology rooted in history and scripture, all aimed at drawing you closer to Jesus.
That school of Christian life, or compendium of the gospel description, really seems to fit based on this.
It does. It paints a picture of a practice with real substance.
And here's maybe a final thought, something interesting these sources bring up implicitly. Think about how this ancient practice uses multiple senses, touch, sound, imagination, to help someone internalize a really complex story.
Yeah, it's tangible, kind of visio divina and lectio divina you carry around.
Exactly. Which makes you wonder, what could you, listening now, potentially gain from a practice that's so tactile, repetitive, yet meditative in connecting with deeper truths, whatever your background might be? Something to consider.